So it's great to see you. Busy times here at Haas, and I wanted to kind of fill you in on some things that I've been doing from a research perspective, a consulting perspective, and also some things that the Haas School has been doing because we're actually practicing what we preach, which gives me great joy. So let me talk a little bit about what I've tried to do over the last 25 years, started when I was 4. Which is to try to demystify this idea of organizational culture. And there have been a set of myths around there that organizations somehow are subject to whatever culture evolves and it can't change. That if they grow, they have to let go of everything they used to do and be completely different. Or that any single individual can't possibly have an impact on the culture. And my work has been an attempt to really help leaders and scholars see that these things are just not true. And sometimes in my darker moments, do we have any consultants here? Okay, so in my darker moments, excuse me in advance, in my darker moments, I think it was somewhat of a plot by consultants who led us to believe that culture change is nearly impossible, takes forever, and will be enormously expensive. And I just don't think that's true, based on the evidence that I have personally witnessed and based on the research that I've done. So really, these are some ways of getting past those myths and thinking about culture in really useful ways. One thing that is true about culture is that a culture will form no matter what. Anytime you get people meeting together on a regular basis where important things are at stake like their job assignments, their status, norms will form. You don't have a choice about that. The only choice you have is the culture that develops one that helps you achieve your strategic objectives? Or worst case scenario, is an unmanaged culture that evolves organically one that constrains you from achieving your strategic objectives? Because of the possibility that an unmanaged culture will actually constrain your strategic success, I think culture is way too important to leave to chance. And there are some very straightforward things that you can do to make sure that doesn't happen. So I've talked for a long time. Any of you who've been in my classes have seen this list before, and the list is still absolutely valid. In fact, I earlier in my career paid attention to the first two, that the culture is strategically relevant and strong, and more recently have gotten serious about this notion of adaptation and agility, which I understand your keynote speaker was talking a little bit about. So let me talk really briefly about a couple of these. So when we talk about a culture being strategically relevant, my favorite kind of recent example is a case that I wrote on one of our alums, Jennifer Cook, who I think she's 97. She'll kill me if it was, I know it says, but I wrote that, so. But yeah, it seems really true, doesn't it? It might be 98. Anyway, Jennifer Cook is, oh, okay, thank you. Oh my God, don't tell her. Yeah, so because she's very youthful. Anyway, Jennifer Cook was a superstar at Genentech, and I say it only in the past tense because, well, I'll tell you what happened later. And Jennifer Cook got promoted into a role in Genentech, heading one of Genentech's 3 major divisions at the time, which was called GEO, the Genentech Immunologic and Ophthalmologic Division. Now, Genentech, as you probably know, is this amazing organization that is literally like curing cancer, has one of the most powerful set of cancer drugs, has really helped us make strides in fighting that disease. And so, in fact, the sort of heart and soul of the organization, at least in these days, was based in oncology. It was like the sexy place to be, right? You want to be anywhere in this organization, you want to be in oncology. That's where the big action is happening. So who's GEO then? And then there's another division called Impact, which was also very, very important. So who's GEO? GEO is everything that's left over, right? Right? It's rheumatoid arthritis drugs, it's asthma drugs, it's eye drugs. And it kind of had been cobbled together with no particular strategic idea. So Jennifer is given the assignment to run GEO, and there's some pressure to make GEO successful pretty quickly. So right away, she and her leadership team put together a pretty aggressive strategy, a 5-year strategy. So this is about 2010, 2011. 300,000 patients from roughly 100,000 is where they were at the time they set the strategy. Consolidating to 3 franchises, because at the same time, did I mention that Genentech and Roche were merging? Oh my God, let's get it more complicated. So now we have 2 rheumatoid arthritis drugs and 2 asthma drugs, and we have to figure out how to pull them together. So 3 franchises and $3 billion, which was about a tripling of what they were doing at the current time. So Jennifer Cook looks around and she's like, okay, we have these aggressive strategic goals. How are we going to make this happen? And because she's a smart Haas student, she says, what kind of culture do we need to drive this success? How can we create kind of cohesion within this organization that's really made up of these separate franchises of these drugs? So she gave me a call, and I went down with my culture tool, which is a quantitative culture assessment. It's complicated, but basically what you have to do is describe the current culture of an organization. I have half the people do that. I have the other half the people describe the ideal organization if you were fully hitting your strategic goals. And then we quantitatively analyze the gaps between the two. This approach is better than the others. It's been tested in research for 25 years. I say that because I'm truly proud of what we've developed and how useful and applied it's been in many, many organizations. And so what Jennifer and her team found from that quantitative analysis was that the culture needed to emphasize 4 things: integrity above all, a patient orientation, a focus on people, and courage and innovation. 3 of the 4 were in pretty good shape. There was not so much of a gap. Courage and innovation was not there. And in fact, Jennifer was concerned that people in GEO were obsessively focused on short-term financial results, to the point that they were not willing to invest in any kind of long-term thinking. And that kind of long-term thinking is exactly what got Genentech where it was. Okay? So part of her message was going to be, and this is the interesting part about culture change. Culture change is usually not about swapping out what you were doing before and not ever doing any of that again and planting down brand new cultural initiatives. Culture is usually about reprioritizing what you're already doing. So here's what she said. She said, I want you to back off slightly on your obsessive focus on short-term financial results, right? Because she can't say, don't worry about short-term financial results. This is a publicly traded company. You got to worry about short-term financial results. Back off slightly in order to make room for the kind of innovation that has made us a fantastic, successful organization with these powerful medicines, right? So this is her plan for executing on the strategy and realizing GEO's vision. So I'm going to hold on that here. There's more to this story that we will come back to. Let me just offer up, for those of you who haven't sort of been in my classroom before, offer up a formal definition of organizational culture, which it is that it's a pattern of beliefs and expectations that people share. There's something about that shared aspect that causes us to adhere to those behaviors and to align our behaviors with those. Now, I tell a story about an experiment that I think some of you certainly will remember. I hope you remember, and I hope you remember the moral of it, but I'm going to retell it for those of you who don't know it. So as Christina said, I'm actually trained as a social psychologist, and so I've thought about behavioral norms a lot. And even behavioral norms and the impact they have on what we do. And norms are things like eye contact, right? And how much eye contact is considered comfortable, and beyond a certain point, like you totally won that staring contest, oh my God, right? And norms vary even across national cultures. So we have norms around how close you should stand to someone, or how animated you should be, or how many questions you should ask. There are all kinds of norms about our behavior that we don't learn through any kind of rule book, but rather through some kind of socialization and observation and so forth. So even I, who had appreciated the power of norms, even I hadn't been as impressed by the power of norms until I heard about a study that was done now almost 2 decades ago. And the study was about hand washing in public restrooms, right? So you know this one, right? So there were some epidemiologists who were interested in hand washing in public settings. So they were good experimentalists. They set up a controlled field experiment with 2 conditions. In the first condition, unsuspecting members of the public at large would walk into a public restroom, and there was another person there. And that person was just doing normal restroom activities, right? Use your not too much imagination, right? So first condition, we're going to record hand washing behavior. Second condition, unsuspecting members of the public at large walk into the public restroom. This time, there's nobody else there. But the researchers have installed a hidden video camera over the sinks to record hand washing behavior. So the research question is, will we see a difference in the incidence of hand washing across the 2 settings? What do you think? So in the first condition, 90% of people wash their hands, which this was a good number for me. You already know who the 10% are there, right? It's okay. I'm all right with that. In the second condition, when people thought they were alone, who remembers that number? 16%. Okay, everybody all together, right? Even the second time, it's like shocking, right? Oh, now, right? So why do I tell you that, right? I want to caution you about the peanuts at the bar, and right, there's all kinds of other reasons. But the real purpose is a kind of social psychological one. We are so influenced in our behavior by other people's expectations of us that we are willing and likely to alter our behavior. That is, to do something different in the presence of another person compared to what we would have done had we been alone. Right? And this is someone we don't know, we never talk to, we'll likely never see them again in our lives, and their mere presence is enough to cause us to do something different. Why? What's the cost of violating shared social norms? What's the cost? Right? At best, you're going to be embarrassed. And I've shown this one before, too, right? Gary Larson was on the science there, right? Right? At best, you're going to be embarrassed. At worst, if you violate a significant enough norm, the group is going to ostracize you, right? And we are interdependent beings, and this is not a good thing for us. So culture in organizations works on the same principle. There are no set of formal rules, policies, and procedures that will be as effective in helping people monitor their own behavior as knowing that others are paying attention. Right? And that's how strong culture works in organizations. So right away you can see that if you don't get the culture right, if the behaviors that you're asking people to prioritize that are strategically relevant are not the ones they're emphasizing, right? It's just as powerful in the other direction. And that's when strong culture can be really a problem, is when substantively the culture is not strategically relevant. So the second criterion, the culture needs to be strong. So I have some, I've been talking a little bit to Zappos. And Zappos, of course, is a major success story. Tony Hsieh is from Marin County, and back in, so they started in 1999, and by 2009, Amazon bought them for over $1 billion, right? Real success story. So let's think about Tony Hsieh's proposition in 1999. So 1999 e-commerce, right? Not really developed. I mean, I think that my computer screen was still one color, right? I'm sure I was holding, if I had a phone, I was holding it with two hands, right? It was the early days of e-commerce in particular. So here comes Tony Hsieh with the following idea. I have the best idea. We are going to sell shoes on the internet. Who's in? It sounded ridiculous, right? Because not only was e-commerce in its infancy, but what do we know about shoes? Oh my God, you got to try them on. Are you kidding? That's like the last thing that we're going to put on the internet, right? You got to be kidding me. So Tony Hsieh knew right from the beginning that he had to create a different kind of organization. He was interested in optimizing on this potential for huge inventory that you could have if you didn't have stores where people had to come to the floor and see the shoes. But he knew that the sort of bottleneck would be if customers aren't willing to order them, try them on, and return them if they don't work, right? You weren't going to have a business. So he knew that he had to make it absolutely seamless. And frankly, has anyone used Zappos? I mean, literally, like you're typing and ordering, and suddenly the shoes appear under your desk, right? I mean, they're just like there right away, right? So he knew that he had to build a really different kind of organization. And that included hiring based on core values and culture fit, which meant that he hired nurses and teachers and social workers, not typical, phone bank kinds of people who actually liked people and were interested in solving their problems. Everybody came in, and no matter what job you were joining, you had 4 weeks of training. 3 of those weeks were on the phone with customers. And at the end of the second week, Tony Hsieh would come to each person and offer them $2,000 to quit. Here you go. Are you in? Right? Why would he do that? What does he want to know? Are you all in? Right? Because it's going to be much cheaper to pay you off now than for you to perform in some mediocre way over the longer run. Great transparency around the culture. No call times for customer service. So the people on the phone can spend as much time solving your problem as you need. And if by chance, and it's never happened to me so far, but if by chance Zappos doesn't have the size or the product that you're looking for, customer service agents are trained on 2 other websites to go and look for that product for you and help you buy it somewhere else, right? So I was talking to some of the senior team a while back, and they told me an interesting story that to me was a totally cultural story. So Tony Hsieh is known as kind of a partier. Zappos is now headquartered in Las Vegas, appropriately. And Tony Hsieh was out one night very late with the Skechers vendors, not the sketchy vendors, but Skechers is a kind of shoe, and they list on Zappos. So Tony Hsieh was out with them, and he'd been bragging all night about how incredible the customer service was and how really that had built the model and been so effective. And the Skechers people are like, yeah, okay. So they get back to the hotel, and everybody's hungry, and they want pizza. And even though all the hotels have all-night room service, they didn't have pizza. So one of the Skechers guys gets the clever idea to call Zappos for pizza, right? So he calls Zappos on his phone, right? The Zappos person picks up, "Hi, this is Zappos. How can I help you?" And the Skechers guy says, "Hey, we want to order 2 large pepperoni pizzas to room 2465 at the Cosmopolitan Hotel." Zappos person, "Hey, well, thanks for calling Zappos. We mostly sell shoes, but let me see if I can find a pizza place that's open." And the Skechers guy says, "Oh, my battery's dying." Click, hangs up. 20 minutes later, knock on the door. They open the door. 2 large pepperoni pizzas with a Post-it note on top. "Thanks for calling Zappos. We mostly sell shoes. Enjoy this pizza with our compliments. Please come and visit us sometime," with their URL. Right? The point is, if you're serious about your culture, you have to let people, particularly on the front lines, make good decisions, judgment calls, and trade-offs about issues as they come in. And particularly this customer service issue is a really important one because you don't ever know how that's going to come in. It's going to look different every single time. And if you clamp your people down with, "Well, we only do this, we never do that, God forbid we would, spring for pizza," right? You will lose your ability to hit targets like providing outstanding customer service. So culture ends up being this amazing potential guiding force for employees, particularly employees on the front lines, so that they can make better decisions, judgment calls, and trade-offs without having to ask someone every time, because that's not an efficient way of doing things, right? So when we talk about a culture being strong, and many of you have seen this 2x2 before, right? There's 4 possibilities, because there are 2 components to a strong culture. One is, do people agree about what's important? And the second is, do people care? So my colleagues and I have sort of been around the world now and assessed organizations on their strength. You can be high on both, strong culture, low on both, weak culture. You can be high on intensity, low on agreement, warring factions, high on agreement, low on intensity, vacuous beliefs. Guess which one of these types is the most prevalent across organizations? So in Silicon Valley, this is number 1, but that's very unusual, right? This is it, vacuous beliefs. Why? What you're asking people to agree with is pretty good stuff. It's easy to agree. "Hey, we're going to treat customers well." "Oh, okay, I like customers." "We're going to be the highest quality." "Sure, put me down for some quality." It's easy to agree. It is much harder to establish the intensity, because usually it means that people have to take a personal risk on behalf of the culture. Whether that risk is springing for pizza, maybe they're not going to get reimbursed, right? Or sanctioning another employee for a failure to uphold the norms. Intensity usually requires going above and beyond and taking some kind of personal risk. That's why it's harder. And so the only solution is to show people that you're serious about culture, and that if they do buy the pizza, it's okay. That's actually what we're looking for. That's like, and I talk about Southwest a lot, and I recently had a fun Southwest story. Satisfying Southwest story, where I was flying. So Southwest is a really strong culture organization. The whole model hinges on employees being willing to do whatever it takes to turn the planes in 15 minutes versus the industry average of 45 minutes, right? So the utilization rates are 12 hours per plane per day versus 9 hours per plane per day. So I had a flight from Oakland down to San Diego, and I was going on April 4th. On April 1st, this was a couple years ago, Southwest had a rare safety breach, which was that they were finding cracks in the fuselage of the 737s that they fly. Of course, the planes were built by Boeing, but they were painted with Southwest, so it was Southwest's problem. So on April 1st, Southwest starts pulling planes off the line for more inspection. So I'm now kind of watching this with two hats on. One is my academic hat. Hey, this is interesting. What's Southwest going to do? The other was my passenger hat. Hey, what is Southwest going to do? Right? Different tones. And by the 3rd of April, I had seen this press release, which you can't really read, so I'll pull out the most important sentence here, which was, our highest priority is the safety of our employees and customers. What's interesting about that sentence? Right? Employees come first, and it's not even alphabetical, right? Right? The thing about building a strong culture is when you're backed against a corner, right, you have to stay with it. And that kind of discipline is what makes culture elusive for many organizations, right? So as an academic, I was overjoyed with this response. This is exactly right, because they talk about how employees come first, and if employees are happy, customers will come back and shareholders will be happy, right? I was overjoyed. This is exactly the right thing to do. And this is an external press release. They could have even done just internal with this order and then external in a different order, right, and gotten away with it. But employees would have noticed, right? As a passenger, not so much. I'm thinking, couldn't they have just done it alphabetically? No. The academic in me won out. I took my flight. It was not the convertible model. And all's well that ends well, right? So 2 lessons so far. Culture won't help unless it's strategically relevant. And second, everybody has to uphold the culture, even when it's hard, a la Southwest, even when it's not absolutely necessary, a la Zappo, and even when no one is looking, right? Because that's when you know that people have internalized what's important in the organization. Okay. So as I said, I've gotten sort of more serious about this last criterion, and this is where some of my new work comes in. So I did a study, actually a trilogy of studies that we just published over the last couple of years, where we looked at 60 of the largest publicly traded high technology firms, right? Because if adaptability matters, it should really matter here. Right? I wanted to pick a dynamic industry where there's some real press for adaptability. I mean, this is a pretty incredible group of organizations, right? They make up much of the Fortune 1000. They generate huge amounts of revenue. They have, it's sort of staggering how much money these organizations generate and how significant they are to our economy and the world economy generally. So we looked at these 60 firms, and we went in and did a culture assessment, essentially. And we looked at 2 aspects of culture that I've just talked about. One is we looked at and measured quantitatively the strength of each firm's culture. And then specifically, we measured intensity around adaptability. To what extent does this culture really embrace adaptability, as we've talked a bit about it? And sure enough, we found that those firms that had both strong cultures that emphasized adaptability were doing great. They did the best of all on any financial metric you want to look at over a 6-year period, every year. Now, you'd think that then the next best, or the worst, let's go to the worst should be the opposite here, right? That should be the worst. That was second. So if you're going to have a weak culture, right, you can do okay. It doesn't really matter where you are on adaptability. You can do okay. The worst option was a strong culture that did not emphasize adaptability. And just to give you a sense of the financial advantage for being in that northeast quadrant there, $5 billion on average. You got a $5 billion gain for your stronger, more adaptive culture, right? Like, that's serious. That's a serious amount of money, right? For most organizations, that was the average Average revenue was in the $30 billion range, right? That's a serious amount of money. Really, really matters. So the question becomes, what do we mean by adaptability? How do you make it happen? Yeah, please.
Is there an obvious example of a really strong culture company that was not adaptable?
Oh, I think you could, yeah, so I'm not actually allowed, I'm not at liberty, based on the university's protocol requirements, to name names, but I think you can think, right? Think of, right? One starts with I, which with 3 letters. I don't know, right? Right? You know, who would you think?
Maybe Oracle?
Yeah.
Hard to say because they've acquired so many companies.
Yeah. Oracle was sort of, yeah, well, yeah, sort of. Yeah, there are bigger examples. I mean, Yahoo was in the sample, so that made it easy, right? But, you know, I mean, just sort of look around. The firms that were doing poorly for the 6 years that we were looking at, which our 6 years ended a year ago, right? They're still not doing well. So go look at the top 60 and.
It's interesting, like Microsoft's culture has changed a lot just because of new leadership in the last year or two.
Yes. Yes. And they're doing okay, actually. Yeah. All right. So the point is in the aggregate, and I think that's where we get the real knowledge from this, is that this is 60 firms. You know, it's not a huge sample, but it's a bigger sample than one-offs, and, you know, does it really matter, and right? So the question then becomes, what are you going to do? How are you going to make this happen? Adaptability is really the product of 2 distinct processes: coming up with good ideas, getting them implemented. What we know about creative ideas is that at least 2 sets of norms are imperative here. One is you have to orient people toward taking risks and surfacing good ideas. And the second is you have to help them realize that the innovation pipeline needs to be this big, right, in order to find the one commercializable idea that you're going to push forward, right? So I often talk about the Gong Show, the mother of all the reality television that we have now, which is so high quality. The Gong Show was unbelievable. I mean, really low budget. An amateur talent act in the 70s where people would get up and do their kind of crappy act until the audience, I don't even know how the voting worked, but when this guy Chuck Barris was finished with the person, he would ring this huge gong and you'd be like dragged off the stage. So Pixar, right, the animation studio where story is their distinctive capability. Pixar is all about the story. That's how they distinguish themselves, right? That's why you sit and watch Pixar movies with your kids, right? Not once, but many, many times. Ratatouille, I know the recipes by heart at this point, right? So Pixar occasionally calls what they call a gong show, and they have a little gong that they got at Pier 1 Imports, and all the animators, you know, and story people go, and everybody has to stand up and pitch their idea until they're gonged off. Why would you do this? What's the psychological process that they're working on? Right, because how often are you going to get gonged off?
All the time.
Every single time, right? The idea that your pitch on Tuesday at 10 is going to become the next Toy Story franchise, right? Infinitesimal possibility. And so what they're combating with this practice, and maybe you use it, maybe you don't, right? There's a Pier 1 import on the way to the highway if you want to drop and get one. But the idea here is psychologically, it's difficult to keep people willing to surface new ideas on a regular basis when their ideas never hit, right? The pipeline needs to be this big to find the 1 or 2 ideas that you're actually going to push forward. Psychologically, you have to figure out ways of helping people feel successful even when their idea isn't pushed forward. You redefine failure. So that's one approach. Then when we get to the implementation stage, thinking about effective team functioning and urgency and speed, very different set of norms. And I like to show this graph because there was a study that did a horse race among these different norms supporting adaptability. So these are the two, support for risk-taking and mistakes, that help people express creative ideas. These are the two, urgency and speed and teamwork, that help get those ideas implemented. And what the researchers did in this case was they went to firms that were already identified as highly innovative, firms with high patent citation counts by industry experts, identifying them as highly innovative, whose products had been, whose revenues had been primarily dominated by new products in the last few years. And when you look at this, what is the biggest differentiator between more and less innovative firms? Which dimension differentiates most? Right, urgency and speed. And which differentiates least? Teamwork. So what does that combination of findings suggest? What do you think? Teamwork is necessary but not a sufficient condition. The differentiator is urgency and speed. And I would go a step further, which is to say that oftentimes we equate teamwork with consensus. And consensus, how long does that take? Forever. And how likely is it to emerge when you're talking about brand new risky ideas? Never. So what this says is many organizations wait too long for a kind of consensus around these risky ideas and miss their opportunity window. So the question is, how do you push through this conflict, right? Because what it shows is that those organizations that are able to move quickly and make something happen do better in terms of adaptability and innovation, right? And suggesting, right, our $5 billion hit, some amount of money and revenue benefit, right? So let me offer up 3 examples, 3 different ways of approaching this tension. One is a 3M example. I've talked for years about 3M. I think they continue to be a really interesting organization because they're big and they're old, which are the 2 antithesis conditions of innovation. And what you see at 3M is a consistent and comprehensive focus on innovation. Anywhere you look, that's what people are emphasizing. In the stories, right? The Post-it note story was a story about failure, right? The adhesive bond was supposed to be all the way sticky. It was supposed to be for asphalt shingles, right? My husband, Russell's a contractor. I asked him, would there be any value in having asphalt shingles that you could peel off from one part of your roof and put over on another part of your roof? And he said, no, none whatsoever. Right? It was an absolute failure, this chemical bond, right? So what the entrepreneurs did, internal entrepreneurs, was they pitched it over at office products, right? And a multi-billion-dollar Post-it note franchise was born, right? So the organization says 30% of our revenues over the last 3 years need to be derived from new products. Right? So specific targets. 15% of your time can be spent thinking up new ideas. If you come up with a new idea, write it down in 3 pages. 3 pages is just like the Gong Show, because when we turn it down, which we will, you're going to be less devastated than if you submitted your 150-page life's work, right? Because we want you to try a lot. We need a whole bunch of these in the pipeline in order to get there. So the 3M approach to the conflict between speed and need for consensus is everything in this organization is about innovation. Second option, the IDEO approach, pilot tests and prototyping. Right? I think that one of the single most underutilized management tools out there is the pilot test. Pilot tests are fantastic because you can do some kind of simulation of your idea in a less risky venue, and you can generate data to then share with skeptics to bring them along with you, and to also inform your own idea about whether it's going to work or not. So do a pilot if you have an idea for culture change. And then the third is perhaps a more cynical option, and that's the Nike option. So I had the privilege of visiting up at Nike a couple of years ago, and I've been a runner for a long time, and so this was like my pilgrimage to Mecca, right, to Nike up in Beaverton, Oregon. And I was invited to meet with Tinker Hatfield, who's sort of the creative genius behind the early running shoes and the Jordan line and all kinds of things. So I got there to Nike, and I checked in at the front desk. I said, hi, I'm here to see Tinker Hatfield. They said, oh, great, well, your escort is here. And I said, well, I could probably find my way there. And they're like, no. So they give me this escort, and we proceed to go through a series of security checks and doors and, right, thumbprints, and I think I gave away one of my children in the process. It's like unbelievable to finally get back to where Tinker Hatfield was, which was in the Nike kitchen, right, which is a secret venue with his hand-picked team. He has all the biomedical equipment back there, a running track, all the fabrics, all the colors, everything that he would need. And I got back there, and he sort of said, the reason I'm back here is because this is a big political organization now, and every time people try to introduce a new idea, it gets killed before you can even get any traction on it. So I'm sequestered myself back here, and of course he has the track record that he can do that, right, till my ideas are ready and I can introduce them to the larger organization. And he said, and frankly, the kitchen has gotten a little bit too public, so next week I'm moving into the pantry, right? He was moving into an even more, I don't know what other security, body scan or whatever you would need to do to get there anyway, right? So that's a less wonderful option, but an option nonetheless. So 3 options for addressing this speed versus agreement tension. One is innovation is valued everywhere in the organization. A second is that you're pilot testing and prototyping things so you can gather more data with less risk. And a third is you're starting things within your part of the organization and getting it all the way there before you introduce it out into the larger organization and see if you can get some traction, right? So those are some options. One thing to think about is what has worked in the organizations that you've been a part of? How have you been able to move innovation along? And here are some ideas when I ask that question that I often hear from people. Okay, so I'm going to move us along because there are 2 fun things that I want to talk about before we break, and we're getting close to the end. So thinking about these levers that you have available to becoming a more adaptable organization, to becoming a strong culture organization. I've talked about this list for a long time. Recruiting and selecting people who fit, training and developing people, rewarding and recognizing them, leading intentionally and visibly. Let me give you an example of why it's important to think about selection and culture fit. And I'm actually doing some new research on this with one of my colleagues, Samir Srivastafa. We have a really fun thing that we're doing. I'll tell you a little bit about at the end. So the strongest culture organizations hire for culture fit. They look beyond necessarily the specific skills and abilities for the entry-level position or the position that a person is coming in to join. So in that light, I wasn't driving. My husband was driving me to the airport on a very rare occasion. It never happens. And we were coming around, what do they call that hospital curve there on 101, right, going by San Francisco down to SFO, right, which of course is also the way to Silicon Valley. And this was on one of the billboards. And so because I wasn't driving, I saw it, right? And this wasn't there, but just this. So of course, what did I do? But I Googled it. And it came up with, right, it's actually a math problem. And it came up with a long number, 7432, blah, 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 blah. I plugged that number in .com, and I was invited to interview at Google. Not invited to submit my resume, invited to interview at Google. Can you come 10 o'clock on Wednesday, right? What is Google selecting on? Not just curiosity, idle curiosity, like totally random, right? What kind of goof? Actually, I was embarrassed at myself, my inner geek, right? Right? So one question you want to ask when you're thinking about bringing in people to fit the culture you're trying to create is, what are the non-negotiables? What are the attributes that transcend all of the jobs that exist within your organization? What orientation do people need to have that really is different perhaps than other organizations? So the second lever has to do with what you do with people once they join. And here's some good news for those of you that don't have a lot of hiring flexibility. My dissertation work was actually really a horse race, testing how much cultural fit bang you can get for your buck via selecting people who fit versus socializing people who fit, right? Developing people once they're already there. So 15% of culture fit came from who you select. 40% from how you develop people once they're already there. Not just early on in their careers, but throughout their careers. This is good news because it means that people are actually able to shift. The question is, can you provide them with a vivid enough picture of what the new version of success looks like that they're able to step up? Right? So part of that is socializing them. And the best tools here are the tools that are the most vivid, telling stories about the founding of our company and what it means, right? The Southwest story about how turn time started. We had to sell a plane, right, and run the same routes. We went to employees, and they said, well, fly the same routes with 3 planes instead of 4. That's how we got turn time down, right? I mean, that story speaks volumes about the culture at Southwest. So part of your job as a culture creator in an organization is to curate the stories that are illustrative of the culture you're trying to create. Pick them out and retell them with their sort of moral and connection to what you're trying to do. So that brings us back to the Genentech story and Jennifer Cook. One of the things that she did was with the gap in between, she really needed people to focus more on what they called courage and innovation, which was her version of adaptability, and Roche was using the word courage, so she put that in there. So one of the things she did was she created laminated placemats. This was a laminated placemat, which you can't read. I have a bigger version of it in a moment. And basically, you could eat your soup at lunch and study about your culture, right? So, right, if you're thinking about helping people understand how to do things differently, you really need to create some clarity for them. So there was a definition of courage and adaptability. We challenge the way things are done with new ideas, fostering an environment where creativity and persistence are rewarded. There were some behaviors and outcomes that they detailed. There were mindset shifts that were imperative. And my favorite part of this, which is actual evidence drawn from parts of the organization that differentiated between when people were on track, right? I focused for months on tweaking my approach until I found a message that works. Now my new idea is implemented, versus missed the mark. People have been encouraged to be outspoken, and after the fact were firmly told they shouldn't have done that and now won't get promoted. Right? This is very, very vivid. Furthermore, what she did, and here's the part where I say, if you're serious about culture and culture change, my best advice is create a spreadsheet, right? Just like any other business process, culture is not this mystical thing that you can't harness. But you have to be focused and disciplined and detailed, and you have to think about it in business process terms. So what Jennifer Cook did and the leadership team did was solicit initiatives from the organization to close the various gaps that they had identified in their culture. They got 250 ideas in. They consolidated them down to what they called the Nifty 50. And then each initiative, Jennifer put together a culture advisory board who served as sort of the clearinghouse for these initiatives and tracking them. Each initiative had a mission, they had a key sponsor, they had a set of objectives. Each year they need to report back on whether they hit their objectives, and each year there's a decision made about whether their work is done and they don't need to continue, or whether they should continue. So how did this work for GEO? So remember I talked about the strategy in 2011 for 2015? So they started the culture work late 2010. By the end of 2011, they hit all their 2015 goals, right? 3, 3, and 3. Jennifer goes back to the organization and says, oh my God, we hit our 2015 goals. What do you want to do next? And they said, we want to go to 4. Right? It was an unbelievable acceleration of performance. The culture assessment was repeated. Courage and innovation still weren't quite there, so they've been working on it still. Some important markers, though, were first that people reported using the culture to help them make day-to-day decisions, judgment calls, and trade-offs. Further, GEO's external reputation was elevated such that now the oncology people were clamoring to come work for GEO, which I think was Jennifer's greatest point of pride in this. And the culture effort continues to thrive under Jennifer's successor. Jennifer was promoted and is running all of commercial operations for Roche Europe. Right? What a great story. Culture change can happen. It can happen quickly. It can help you strategically. But you have to be serious and disciplined about it. Okay, so finally, we talk a little bit about rewards aligned with leader behavior, and I've talked a lot about these. I won't take your time on this, but I want to talk for a little bit about what we're doing here at the Haas School. So there's this other part of culture that if you get the internal culture right, you actually get external brand benefits as a result. Right? And part of the question about culture is, who do we want to be known for? And that could be a question that, for an internal department, who do you want to be known for within your organization? It can also be for the whole organization, who do you want to be known for your various constituents? So, as you know, Dean Lyons and the school have been very involved in identifying and implementing the defining principles. Who can recite them without looking? Right? Question the status quo, confidence without attitude, students always beyond yourself. And before this talk, I polled a variety of people who are working on behalf of the school and found that we've actually made an enormous amount of progress. So Dean Lyons was extremely pleased in terms of fundraising. He did a little survey of our amazing Haas board members to ask them how important they thought the defining principles were as a strategic differentiator for us and for our future ahead. And to a person, they said the defining principles were maximally important. They also funded 50% of our brand new building. In terms of admissions, and this is my favorite new phrase that I just made up last night, we admit for fit, right? If you've looked at, thank goodness you don't have to look at any admissions, any applications, hopefully ever again in your entire life. My daughter just went through the college admissions process this year. And thank goodness my other daughter is 9 years younger, because I'm going to need 9 years to recover from that, right? But on the admissions process, we ask our applicants to really talk about themselves in terms of the defining principles, right? And that really shows us whether they understand them and whether they resonate with them. And when they come, we hear formally that about 1 in 3 came because they perceived the fit to be so good, and we think that number is actually an underestimate because we asked it in a very formal way. In executive ed, and Christina helped with these data, we continue to win a slew of customers, and Christina offers great testimonials, who come to us and turn down proposals from other top schools because they perceive that there's a culture fit. And these are great organizations. These are important wins for us. In terms of alumni engagement, we did a survey recently. Maybe you remember, maybe you don't. Awareness of the defining principles is now extremely high. 75% of our alums report knowing about them. And if you came to school here within the last 10 years, 90% in that group report knowing about them. Some people believe these defining principles to be so central to their identity that they have posted them on LinkedIn profiles and so forth. And finally, in terms of jobs, and we're, I think, going to get more systematic about this part, but Dean Lyons said to me the other day, he said the phrase, and you've probably heard him say this, the phrase confidence without attitude first came from a recruiter in saying why they choose to hire from Berkeley as opposed to other schools that will remain, I don't know, confidence with attitude, I don't know. I don't have much hard data on this front, he says, but I do know that the defining principles have been a plus with all the recruiters that I've spoken to about. And this has given me the idea that we need to go out and figure that out a little bit better. But I think that there's something happening there too. So again, not only do you get internal clarity, but you get external brand benefits by getting the culture right internally. So a couple summaries here, and then let me tell you about what I've been doing very, very recently. And then I'll ask questions, and then we'll call it a morning. So using culture as a leadership tool requires that the culture is strategically relevant. Can you promote the behaviors you need to actually get you through to your strategic objectives? It needs to be strong. People need to both agree about what's important, but there also needs to be intensity. People need to be willing to take risks on behalf of upholding the culture. The culture needs to emphasize innovation, adaptation, and change over time. And you have these levers available to you for modifying a culture that is not meeting those criteria effectively. And remember my warning, no matter what you do or don't do, a culture will form. The risk of not paying attention to culture is that it's going to get in your way, and that's a problem. So figure out a culture that is consistent, coherent, and comprehensive. And my strong view is that you will be better off as a result. Okay, so then at the end of something like this, my mom would say, well, so what else is new, right? Like, what else have you been up to? Because she's demanding, let's just say. So I wanted to just end by telling you a couple of projects that I've got on the books right now, and welcoming your input and thanking you for your contributions, because it lets us all do fun stuff like this. So one of the things, just to be a little bit provocative, and you know, we are here at Berkeley, and I know I'm not really supposed to talk about politics, but the term political correctness has been thrown around a lot, and I just published a paper on the benefits of political correctness. So when people say that political correctness is like a bad thing, that's not altogether true. When you bring diverse groups together, diverse meaning mixed sex or mixed race or people from different functional areas within an organization, it turns out that it's really important to emphasize political correctness to boost creativity. And this is somewhat paradoxical, because the very thing that political correctness was thought to dampen was people's willingness to express risky ideas out loud. And we found exactly the opposite with like real, this was published in our top journal, so it's real intense, hardcore, experimental research, right? So that one is very fun, and there's more to be done there. A second thing I mentioned, I'm doing some work with Samir Srivastava, and one of the things that we're doing is we're trying to see whether culture is embedded in language, and specifically using the power of big data. We're analyzing email exchanges for an organization over a 3-year period. And you know how many emails we have? Like 50 million emails, right? And thank goodness for computers. If you see the lights dimming, that means we're running some of our studies right now. But we're interested in finding whether there are leading indicators in language of culture change, whether you can anticipate that things are changing by finding pockets, networks within your organization of people who are starting to do things a little bit differently, and whether that's something that can be harnessed. So that's pretty fun. And then finally, my favorite project that I'm immersed in right now is a project on Himalayan mountain climbing expeditions and what we can learn in business organizations from these expeditions. We have a data set of all the expeditions that have occurred in modern Himalayan climbing history since 1950. Great records have been kept. And we're finding some very, very interesting things. Most importantly, it turns out that above and beyond climbing skill and how much oxygen you use and how many support staff you have and what the weather is like, above and beyond all that stuff, what really matters in terms of making it to the top or not and dying or not is what the norms are in the group. So we find that groups that are diverse with regard to national orientation, where people come from in the world, groups that are diverse nationally, do better if they adopt cooperative norms. They're more likely to make it to the summit. However, we find when experience diversity is high, and groups, right, so that some are very experienced and some are less experienced, and the group adopts cooperative norms, more people die. So what this means is that really being precise about the kind of norms that are essential to the task at hand is important. And part of my research line of work is to try to help managers really do the mental calculus around the kind of norms that you need. What this study shows is that cooperativeness causes us to blur. The paper is called, I know this is really cheap shot, it's called blurred lines. Right? But what we find is that people indiscriminately blur differences from people, even when sometimes those differences, like experience differences, are essential to maintain. And so the trick is, right, in a diverse workplace, how to minimize the diversity that doesn't really matter to the task, but also accentuate the diversity that you need to pay attention to get it done. So that's my favorite one right now. So that's what's going on here. Thank you so much for coming. It's such a pleasure to see all your faces. Let me know if you have any questions. Stay in touch. Great to see you. Wish we saw you more often. Thanks so much.